Yes, so as I was saying, Maxwell Miao is my name, and it's my pleasure to be here to talk to you on this very important topic of Africa's engagement with international law and development over the years. As the topic suggests, and first of all, I thank the school, the different departments for having invited me here to share with you knowledge, particularly in this area of knowledge, practice, and resistance in international development. In this lecture, I think I will provide you with an account of the various ways with which international project of development has been received, embraced, and even contested by and in Africa, and the role that international law has played in the interaction between Africa and the development project. I must say at the very beginning that I am one of the recent recruits of TWAIL scholarship. TWAIL Third World Approaches to International Law is that school that is dedicated to the critique of international law, as well as the visions of reconstructing international law from a third world perspective. And third world in this particular case means an analytical category. I must also say that this presentation arises from our recently published book by Oxford University Press, where we were invited to give our reflections of Africa's engagement and interactions with international development law. Fortunately enough, as at the time we embarked on this project, I had just concluded my PhD, where, again, in the subject of international development law, I was engaging or making an inquiry into how international law constructs accountability for international development institutions, particularly the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And of course, I did find out, and I think that's why we were able to enrich this project, this topic of Africa as a theater of international law and development. I did find out that indeed international law, and of course by international law I'm talking about international law, international norms, processes, policies, principles, including international institutions. International law constructs and rationalizes accountability avoidance when it comes to international institutions. And the same applies also when you're talking about international, other international actors such as states. So I found that international law tends to construct and sanction and rationalizes accountability avoidance for international development institutions. And of course, I was able to establish that because of such quality of the marked absence of direct and distinct accountability, international law has always failed to secure economic justice. International law has always failed to secure economic justice for those people who face the cruel logics of marginalization and social exclusion. Perhaps this is a complex topic we can engage in another day, another time, at a different fora, a different event. So in the book chapter, we were able to make a general inquiry into Africa's experience, even though at a sufficient level of abstraction, of how Africa has been a theater. So we're talking about Africa as a theater of international development law. So basically the question there is, the interface of international law and development project and how it has been received, embraced, and contested in Africa. When we are talking about the idea of a theater, which I think was one of the most interesting thing in this book, is what exactly do we mean by a theater? We do know that a theater is where, drama, fictionalized drama happens. So that the international law project is both fiction and real life drama in Africa. So by fiction, of course, we mean, the labels, the representations, and images that have been coined at the level of rules, policies, principles, and institutions to shape our own understanding of the development project in its various dimensions. And of course, in terms of the real drama, the real life drama, other than fiction, we were concerned with praxis. Of course, we do understand that praxis is where theory meets practice. So how is the actual operationalization and institutionalization of these images, representations, and labels? And the entailed processes and activities of development when we're talking about rules and policies. And I think what we found out, looking at Africa as a theater of international law and development, what we find out, of course, is that, as a matter of fact, that key development actors usually make their own interventions using these labels and images, which you may call as fiction. The images and law of development. So for instance, here we are talking about images, labels, and representations. How do you define certain aspects, norms, and policies of development? And of course, some of the images and representation and labels we found out include things like, development as growth, development as basic needs, structural adjustment programs. Remember, this is language. Language being used to depict reality in form and image, label, or representation. Poverty reduction strategies, concepts such as poor and highly indebted countries. Now, these are some of the defining labels and images, what we call fiction, that have been operationalized and practiced in the realm of development in Africa. So later on, I will be able to demonstrate how Africa has either contested or embraced these labels and representations and images, either in terms of knowledge, practice, and its own experience of resistance. And of course, I do this from what Professor Thuo Gathi, also another 12 scholar, calls either contributionism or critique. So you'll see that Africa has engaged with the international law and development, particularly the development project, either as contributors or as critiques. And of course, the contributionism is the approach that is centered in the belief that as an innovator and generator of international norms, it is the view that international norms derive their own origins from diverse traditions, including those of Africa. And the critical tradition is the school of thought that criticizes certain aspects and norms of international law. Okay? And of course, criticize the structural arrangements and imbalances of the international political economy that frame and condition Africa's experience of the relative disadvantage in global affairs. Now, talking about knowledge, practice, and resistance, let's go first to the real characteristics or the key characteristics of international law and development praxis that has been manifested in the African continent or Africa as a theater. Now, talking about the characteristics of international development law in Africa, I will give you a brief ideas of a few scholars that have critiqued Africa's interaction with the international law project. First, one of them is Professor Okafor, who is here with us, and in his characterizing of international development law, he calls it a colonial praxis of tutelage, and I will explain this. That is the first one of them. Professor B.S. Chimney, of course, one of the third world scholars of international law, has also looked at the character of international development law from a third world perspective, and he christens it an imperial global state. How does this come about? And I was looking at one fiction, one image, one label that international financial institutions have relied on. There are quite a number, of course, that international financial institutions have relied on, such as I said, concepts such as poverty reduction strategies, poverty growth framework, development as economic growth, and so forth. But here, I looked at the concept that has come, the World Bank and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank have referred to as the concept of global public goods. Global public goods. Now, if you look at the engagement of the World Bank does 2 or 3 critical things: development financing, and next to that is poverty reduction interventions. The International Monetary Fund, on the other hand, and these interventions, they justify them under the fiction called global public goods, that they are involved in the provision of global public goods. One of the global public goods is development financing by the World Bank, and lending, surveillance, and advisory of the IMF. Now, take, for instance, the investment project financing by the World Bank, which they offer to developing and transition economy countries, and as well as technical, capital, and financial assistance, which of course always involves knowledge transfer and technical advice in design and implementation of projects. Now, the IMF, under this rubric of global public goods that justifies the intervention, also manages the health of the global economy, managing the health of the global economy. And they also review the state's financial and regulatory frameworks that justify their interventions in this country. Now, you will realize that these interventions by these institutions under the fiction of global public goods is actually a euphemism for intervention by these international financial institutions. And as Professor Okafor has indicated, one of the key features of international development law is that it brings what he calls a manipulative control dynamic in which development institutions enlist the aid of international norms and precepts into their own way of seeing the world, as well as a way of enculturing a particular peoples into that way of seeing the world.